want to know what this verse is talking about. And so to do that, we have to go back to the beginning of chapter 7, where there's two stories, and I want to go over them just briefly. The first story is about Jesus, how he heals a centurion servant. And then the second story is when Jesus raises a widow's son. So in the first story, when we hear these stories, or when you hear that this is what the disciples have just told John, then you think, well, these are some really spectacular miracles. Jesus just had healed these people. So you think, what would the big deal be? What's going through the disciples' minds? What's going through John the Baptist's minds that would cause John the Baptist to have doubt? And if you're not sure, if you don't remember, that John the Baptist, as the passage says, he was the man who came before Jesus and he got the people ready, even though there was no promise that the people would listen to John. So in the first story, when we're talking about the centurion, he was an officer in the Roman army. He was a disciplinarian. And so he was not, the centurions, they weren't full Jewish converts yet. So with who they were, that would have made them unclean. So just for Jesus to go forth to a centurion and accept the invitation to go to the centurion's home to heal his servant would have been considered impure of Jesus. And so when the Jews, they're expecting a Messiah, and when they're told that a Messiah is coming, somebody greater is coming to save them, and they're thinking that it's going to be, the Messiah is going to be a man who's going to lead them and save them from the Romans, who were their enemy. And so that's who they were expecting. And so here's Jesus, when we study Jesus' ministry, we know that he didn't do the things that was expected of him. He went outside the norms, the social norms of that time. So he was doing what they weren't thinking that a Messiah would do, these impure things. Because they wanted Jesus to punish the sinners, but instead he was forgiving them and he was healing them. And so for him to do that with the centurion was a big deal. And then in the second story, when Jesus raises a widow's son, in verse 11 it says, soon afterward Jesus went to a town, and verse 12, as he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And so what's going on? What Jesus is coming across is a funeral. And so here's this boy that's being carried out on a stretcher, or also called a bier. And so what was Jewish customs at that time was whenever there would be a funeral going on, they would have this march. And whenever that march would go by, anybody who saw would stop what they were doing and they would follow. They would follow that march, says with respect. And so another thing was, as this boy is being carried out, he's being carried out on this stretcher. And it was considered unclean for somebody outside of the family, somebody who wasn't close to that person, to touch that person. It was only the close family who would handle the bodies. And so for Jesus, again, for him to go forth and to touch this body, or even to touch the stretcher, would have been considered a very big deal. And again, would have been an unclean or impure act. So when we go back to the passage, John's disciples have just come and told John what's happened. And at this time, John the Baptist, he was put in prison. And so he hadn't been able to hear about what Jesus had been doing and what had been going on. And so in verse 19, he says, are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else? So then John's messengers, they go to Jesus and they deliver the message. In verses 21 through 23, Jesus gives him his response. He tells them to go back to John and tell them that this is what's happened. This is the miracles that have been performed. And so then in verse 24, after John's messengers left, Jesus began to speak to the Jesus doesn't strike down John. He doesn't tell him, well, why would you have these doubts? It's a bad thing. But instead he lifts him up. In verse 28, when I first read that, it was a little puzzling at first, because it says, among those born of women there is no one greater than John, yet the one who is least in the kingdom of God is greater than he. And I thought, well, how is Jesus lifting him up yet bringing him down at the same time? But then I realized that through talking with people and studying, that he was still lifting him up, but he was lifting us up as well. Because John wasn't able to have that relationship that we are able to have with Jesus because of the sacrifice that Jesus made for us, because of his crucifixion. We are freely able to enter into salvation because of what Jesus did. So the people in Jesus' time and all throughout history, to here right now, we have salvation free. And that is what makes us greater than John. So what do I want to pull out of this passage? Well, one of the biggest things is we see that here's John the Baptist. He's a prophet. He's a man who you would expect, if he goes to prepare the way for Jesus, you wouldn't think that he would have doubts. You wouldn't think that he would be questioning Jesus and who Jesus is. Is he really the Messiah? That's not what we would expect from him. But that's what we see. And I think sometimes we think that whatever is going on in our lives, we think that if we have any sort of doubt, if we have any kind of question where we're not sure if what God is doing is right, if we're not sure if Jesus really is our Savior, if we're not sure that God is who he says he is, whatever the questions we have in our lives, we think that those things aren't okay, they're not okay to think. We think that it's bad. But that's why this passage is so important, is because it tells us otherwise. And I think the reason why we think these things is because that's what we experience here on earth. Any kind of authority figure that we come across and they do something we're not sure about, or we're not sure why they have the power that they do, we're immediately struck down and told, how dare you question this authority? And so I think that, when we have these questions or these doubts about God, that we're going to get the exact same response. How dare you question the Almighty God? How dare you question Jesus, the one who saved you? How dare you? And in some ways, it's almost engraved into our minds, into our hearts sometimes, when we do have doubts or questions. I want to give you an example, just to maybe put a picture on it. When I was in high school, it was the very last semester of my senior year. I went through this period of time where I wasn't sure if God existed. And it all started was I listened to some words that got into my head, and I let them stay there too long till they got into my heart. And so for a certain amount of time, I wasn't sure about God. I wasn't sure about what I was doing when I came to church. I wasn't sure if what I was listening to was true. And I thought, for sure, even if God is real, he's mad at me. He'd have to be, because I'm questioning him. And of course, that brought me down even further. And I think it was one of the hardest times that I've gone through, because I just felt this shame looking down upon me. Like I felt that God was mad at me. I thought that he was angry, and I thought that so many times I think that if we have these doubts and these questions, that we are no longer going to be welcomed into the family of Christ. So a lot of times we don't talk about it. And that's what I did. That's what I felt. I felt like I was no longer welcome in God's family, and so I didn't talk about it. It was something I just walked around and I just smiled and said, yes, I believe in God, but inside I wasn't so sure. And here's the difference between my story and John the Baptist, is right away when John had doubts, he went straight to Jesus. Through the disciples, he said, deliver this message to Jesus. I'm not sure if you really are our Messiah. He continued the communication. He kept talking to Jesus. That's not something that I did. In fact, I closed the communication. I closed him off because I thought, well, if he's not real, then why should I pray? And if he's mad at me, he's not going to listen to me. And so I thought, I'm just not going to pray. So I stopped communication. And as a result, I got further away from God. And that happens sometimes in our lives when we're going through these struggles, we're going through these trials. If we have relationship problems, even on earth, if we're having a problem with somebody in our lives, if we stop talking to them, it doesn't get resolved. But here in this passage, John the Baptist goes straight to Jesus and tells him, this is the doubt that I'm having. And Jesus lifts him up. He doesn't tell him, you should be ashamed of yourself. And so my story, of course, it had a good ending, of course, and I'm still here, and I'm still living and still doing my best to grow in Jesus and grow in God. What God did for me was, and I know I've talked about it before, but he sent me to college, and he got me to be a part of a group called InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And in that group, I grew closer to God than I ever had been before, and that I ever thought I would be. And now God, he is my Father, and Jesus is my Savior. He is the Messiah. So whatever it is that you're going through, whether it be financial trouble, if you're not sure if you're going to make next month's payments, if you're going through a relationship crisis, and there needs to be some reconciliation, and you think, well, God's not on my side, or if you think that if you are having health issues, and you think maybe God's mad at you for some reason, or if you've suffered a loss, no matter what it is in your life, if you have any sort of doubt, if you have any sort of question, I want you to know that it is okay. It's okay because God doesn't mind questions. He doesn't mind if you're not sure. He doesn't mind it at all. And God's not mad at you. He wasn't mad at me. And I came to know that. He wasn't mad at me. And he wasn't mad at John the Baptist. He's not going to be mad at you. In fact, he's going to lift you up. Just like with what Jesus did for John, he lifted him up. He will lift you up too. I want to close with actually something that this past semester in one of my classes, I can't remember exactly which class it was, but one of my classmates, we were talking about faith, and one of my classmates, his name was Joe, he chimed in and he said this: if you can't allow your faith to be tested, then what faith do you have at all? And at first I thought, well, if your faith is tested so easily, doesn't that mean that your faith is small? And then I kind of sat back and I thought about it. And then I realized that that statement is true. Because it doesn't matter if your faith is tested, because that's what's going to happen. We're going to go through hard times. We're going to have struggles. And you know what? God knows that it's hard because he's been here. He knows what it's like to be on earth. He understands. He understands more than anybody. Which is why it's so important to keep talking to him, to tell him what you're feeling. I realized that what my classmate said was right, because if you can't allow your faith to be tested, is it because somebody told you so, or is it because you know?